The tongue is disabled. That is the show.
That is the show.
That's the concept.
Bill Murray didn't become controversial overnight, and he didn't suddenly transform at 75 into something Hollywood didn't recognize. Instead, the industry finally caught up to a pattern that had been forming quietly, awkwardly, and sometimes painfully for more than 5 decades, because long before projects were canceled, before co-stars hesitated, and before headlines framed him as difficult or unpredictable, Murray had built an entire career on existing just slightly outside the lines, living in a gray space where genius, chaos, charm, and damage overlapped in ways people laughed at when he was young and tolerated when he was profitable but now feel harder to excuse. Born on September 21, 1950, in Evanston, Illinois, and raised in Wilmette inside a cramped, noisy Irish Catholic household bursting with 9 children, Murray learned early that humor wasn't just entertainment, it was survival, a way to be seen without demanding space, a way to soften grief before it could harden. His father, Edward Murray, sold lumber and struggled with diabetes, bringing home a modest income that barely stretched across Catholic school tuition, groceries, and hand-me-downs, while his mother Lucille held the family together with discipline, exhaustion, and quiet resilience. The Murray boys hauled golf bags at Indian Hill Club for a few dollars, pooled every cent, and learned the value of showing up even when you didn't feel like it. But inside that crowded home, there was one unspoken rule that shaped Bill's future more than any classroom ever would. If you weren't funny, you did the dishes, and Bill learned very quickly how to be funny. When his father died suddenly in 1967 at just 46, the laughter thinned and the weight settled in, leaving a 17-year-old Bill caught between grief and rebellion, watching his mother work long hours in a medical supply mailroom while the family tried not to unravel, and watching his older brother Brian drift towards Second City, a place that would soon become a lifeline. Bill wasn't built for stability or straight lines. He flirted with structure at St. Joseph's and Loyola Academy, played golf, formed a rock band called the Dutch Masters, sang Beatles covers, improvised lyrics, and absorbed the mythology of American outlaws and frontier rebels, men who lived by instinct rather than instruction. And by the time he moved to Denver in 1968 to study pre-med at Regis College, it was already clear that traditional success didn't fit him. His grades collapsed, his attention wandered, and eventually he hitchhiked back to Illinois, collecting strange encounters and half-formed lessons that would later surface in his work. Because Bill Murray didn't learn through books, he learned through friction. That friction exploded publicly in 1970 on his 20th birthday at O'Hare Airport, when a careless joke about bombs led security to discover nearly 10 pounds of marijuana in his luggage. A scandal splashed across the Chicago Tribune that could have ended everything before it began, but instead became a pivot point. He didn't spiral, he redirected, dropping out for good and stepping through the door Brian had cracked open at Second City, where Murray's offbeat lounge singer persona, reckless improvisation, and total disregard for polish made him impossible to ignore. He was dangerous in the way audiences couldn't quite predict, the way something might fall apart at any second, and that danger followed him to National Lampoon Radio Hour in New York, to early television failures, and eventually to Saturday Night Live, where he didn't immediately shine but slowly embedded himself into the show's DNA by being relentlessly odd, stubbornly deadpan, and just uncomfortable enough to feel real. Murray didn't chase laughs. He waited for them to come to him, whether it was portraying Abraham Lincoln as a job applicant, posing rag dolls like living sculptures, ranting about cinnamon bun monuments, or turning sketches into barely controlled experiments in chaos. And behind the scenes, that chaos was just as real, from fireworks pranks to open feuds, setting a precedent that brilliance and volatility could coexist if ratings stayed high. When Hollywood took a chance on him with Meatballs and then Caddyshack, that volatility became bankable, turning improvisation into mythology and temper into lore, even when it cost money, broke sets, or left co-stars uneasy, because Murray's unpredictability felt authentic in an industry obsessed with control. But as his career deepened, so did the cracks. His commitment to method blurred into antagonism, whether embodying Hunter S. Thompson so completely he couldn't shake it, stalking Richard Dreyfuss during What About Bob, or pushing boundaries on set in ways that felt funny until they didn't. And by the time Groundhog Day arrived, Murray's exhaustion, bitterness, and existential frustration bled directly into his performances, creating something timeless but leaving real damage in its wake. His evolution into a quieter, sadder, more introspective presence through films like Rushmore, The Royal Tenenbaums, Lost in Translation, and Broken Flowers didn't erase the past. It reframed it, turning years of restlessness into a cinematic language of regret, alienation, and emotional drift that resonated deeply with audiences who had grown older alongside him. Yet even as he gained critical respect, the stories followed. Clashes on set, whispered rumors, legal battles, vanishing acts, unresolved tensions, and finally the reckoning that arrived in 2022 when a misconduct complaint halted production on Being Mortal and forced the industry to confront behavior it had long excused as eccentricity. Murray's response wasn't defensive in the way people expected. He didn't deny everything, didn't issue a polished apology, didn't disappear entirely, but instead spoke in the same strange, sideways manner he always had, calling it stupid, painful, humiliating, admitting fault without fully surrendering control of the narrative, which only fueled the conversation further. In an era less willing to separate art from accountability, Murray found himself reassessed not as a lovable wild card, but as a complicated figure whose legacy now includes both transformative performances and uncomfortable truths. And yet, even now at 75, he keeps showing up in indie films, surprise cameos, whispered confessions at festivals, jazz tours, and odd reinventions, still resisting closure, still refusing a clean ending, because Bill Murray was never meant to be resolved neatly. He is the product of grief masked as humor, freedom tangled with damage, brilliance intertwined with consequence, and his story, like his performances, doesn't land on a punchline but lingers in the silence after, asking whether we can hold admiration and discomfort in the same frame, and whether laughter, once earned, is ever truly innocent again. And maybe that lingering discomfort is exactly why Bill Murray's story refuses to settle into a clean moral, because unlike stars who carefully curate redemption arcs, Murray has always seemed almost allergic to resolution, as if pinning him down would strip away the very energy that made him matter in the first place. Hollywood has always loved its rebels until rebellion stops being charming, and Murray's version of rebellion was never loud protest or ideology. It was smaller, stranger, more destabilizing, the refusal to behave the way systems expect you to behave, whether that system was a television show, a film set, a studio contract, or later, the unspoken rules of aging gracefully in the public eye. For years, that refusal read as authenticity. Audiences saw him crash weddings, show up uninvited to college parties, bartend randomly at dive bars, photobomb strangers, and vanish without agents or managers, reachable only through a mysterious voicemail number. And those stories spread like modern folklore, reinforcing the idea that Murray existed outside the machinery, that he was one of the last movie stars who didn't need permission. But folklore has a way of sanding down sharp edges, and as time passed, the same unpredictability that once felt magical began to look irresponsible when viewed through a wider lens, especially by younger generations less inclined to excuse discomfort as eccentric genius. The industry's patience shifted not because Murray suddenly changed, but because the cultural calculus did. Behavior that once hid behind box office numbers and insider silence now faced scrutiny amplified by social media, labor protections, and a broader reckoning with power dynamics that had always been present but rarely named. Murray himself seemed aware of this shift, even if he never articulated it cleanly, and in recent interviews his tone softened, his bravado dulled, replaced by something closer to weariness, a sense that the tricks no longer worked the way they used to. He spoke about laziness not as arrogance but as confession, about waiting for roles instead of chasing them, about the strange hollowness that follows decades of being applauded for being unpredictable, as if unpredictability itself eventually becomes a cage. In quieter films, he leaned into characters defined by absence rather than action. Men haunted not by dramatic failures but by small accumulations of regret, missed connections, words unsaid, moments mishandled, and those performances resonated precisely because they felt less like acting and more like exposure. Yet even then, Murray resisted the language of apology. He framed his mistakes as lessons, his flaws as texture, and his conflicts as misunderstandings shaped by time and temperament, a stance that frustrated critics who wanted clarity but aligned perfectly with a man who had never believed in tidy explanations. There is something profoundly American about that contradiction, the myth of the flawed individualist who both resists authority and benefits from it, who disrupts systems while being protected by them, and Murray embodied that myth long before it became controversial to do so. As Hollywood evolved, the question stopped being whether Murray was talented. No serious observer disputes that. But whether talent alone could outweigh harm, whether cultural contribution grants moral exemption, or whether the laughter he generated came at costs too often absorbed by others in silence. Murray never answered those questions directly, perhaps because answering them would require him to stop moving, and movement has always been his defense, his instinctive response to discomfort. He moves from set to set, city to city, role to role, jazz club to golf course, festival to festival, staying just ahead of narrative closure, just beyond final judgment. Even his most famous characters mirror this restlessness. Phil Connors trapped in time, Bob Harris drifting through Tokyo, Steve Zissou chasing an impossible shark, Don Johnston driving endlessly without destination. All men suspended between self-awareness and inertia, capable of reflection but slow to change. In that sense, Murray has been telling the same story for decades, refracting it through comedy, melancholy, absurdity, and silence, as if circling a truth he can feel but never quite articulate. And perhaps that's why the recent controversies landed with such force, because they didn't contradict his image. They completed it, revealing the shadow side of the freedom audiences had romanticized for years. To some, this reframing feels like betrayal. To others, it feels overdue. And to Murray himself, it seems to register as something closer to inevitability, the long-delayed accounting that comes when a lifetime of improvisation collides with an era that demands intention. Still, he remains curiously present, not retreating into obscurity or defensive isolation, but stepping cautiously into smaller projects, accepting diminished centrality, allowing himself to be seen as fallible rather than iconic, a shift that may be less about reinvention and more about endurance. At 75, Murray no longer carries the manic energy of his early years, but the restlessness remains, now quieter, tinged with reflection, as if he's finally listening to the echoes of rooms he once barreled through. Whether history ultimately frames him as a cautionary tale, a complicated artist, or both, his legacy resists reduction, because Bill Murray was never just the joke or the damage or the apology or the talent. He was the tension between them, the unresolved equation that never quite balances, and maybe that's why his story still holds attention. Not because it reassures us, but because it refuses to, reminding us that the people who make us laugh the hardest are often wrestling with forces they don't fully understand themselves, and that sometimes the most honest ending isn't redemption or condemnation, but the uneasy acknowledgement that brilliance and consequence can occupy the same space, long after the laughter fades.